They never knew what childhood meant. No games under the sun, no laughter echoing through open fields, no mother's lullaby to chase away the night. For them, childhood was chains. Childhood was darkness. Childhood was being sold before they could even speak their own names. Across deserts and oceans, through jungles and city streets, millions of children were caught in the vast machinery of the slave trade, torn from their homes, stripped of their families, and forced into a life they did not choose. History remembers empires, merchants, and kings. It remembers revolts and laws and revolution and abolition. But what it often forgets are the children. This is their story, a story of stolen innocence, a story of small footsteps that walked into history and never walked back. Before the chains came, life for many children in Africa was simple and vibrant. In the villages that stretched across the Sahel, children ran barefoot through red earth, playing games beneath the baobab trees. They learned stories from elders around the fire, learned how to fish from their fathers, and learned how to weave baskets beside their mothers. Their lives were woven with family, tradition, and dreams of growing up to be warriors, healers, farmers, storytellers. But beyond the horizon, a storm was forming. The world was changing. Hunger for power and wealth in distant lands had turned human life into a commodity. Traders from Arabia, the Ottoman Empire, and Europe were casting their nets deeper into the continent, seeking not only strong men and women for labor but also children, pliable, obedient, and easy to control. At first, the threat felt distant, but slowly, stories began to drift into the villages, stories of kidnappings near rivers, of boys disappearing from market roads, of little girls vanishing on their way to collect water. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for centuries. It often happened in the dead of night. The silence would break with shouting, fire, and the thundering of hooves. Armed raiders, sometimes hired by foreign traders, sometimes led by local collaborators, would storm the village. Mothers would clutch their children close. Fathers would try to fight, often with nothing but farm tools in their hands. But resistance was almost always crushed. Children were pulled from their beds, screaming for their parents. Brothers were dragged one way, sisters another. Some tried to run and were struck down. Others were too small to understand what was happening, crying only because their mothers were crying. In a matter of minutes, the familiar world of home and safety vanished forever. For many, that night was the last time they ever saw their families. Some were marched for hundreds of miles on foot, tiny legs struggling to keep pace with the adults around them. Others were stuffed into wooden carts, bound together by ropes too heavy for their small wrists. If they fell behind, they were beaten. If they cried too loudly, they were silenced. The journey to the coast or to the desert routes was brutal. Hunger gnawed at their bellies. Heat blistered their skin. Seas swept through their ranks. Many children did not survive the journey. Those who did would face something far worse than death, a life of endless servitude. Some were forced across the scorching Sahara, their bare feet sinking into burning sand as they marched for weeks toward the slave markets of North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. The smallest children were often carried on the backs of older captives, until the older captives collapsed and never rose again. Others were dragged to the coast, crammed into the dark holds of slave ships bound for foreign lands. The journey across the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean was a nightmare beyond imagination. Children were packed so tightly they could barely move. The stench of sickness and death filled the air. Many did not survive the voyage. Their bodies were thrown overboard into the unforgiving sea. Those who reached the other side did not find mercy. They were lined up on auction blocks, examined like livestock, their teeth checked, their bodies poked and prodded. Some were bought as domestic servants. Some were forced to work in fields. Some were given as gifts to royal courts or wealthy families. And many, especially young girls, were sold into concubinage, their childhood stolen in the most intimate and brutal way imaginable. What does childhood mean when every hour belongs to someone else? Children were forced to carry heavy loads long before their muscles were strong enough. They cooked, cleaned, fetched water, and worked in fields under the lash of overseers. They were punished for mistakes they did not understand. They were given new names, forbidden to speak their native languages, and told to forget the families they had lost. Many were deliberately kept uneducated, their ignorance a form of control. Others were trained for specific roles, as house servants, as soldiers, or as attendants in palaces. Some were raised to believe they were part of the master's household, even loved, but they were never free. The psychological scars were just as deep as the physical ones. Children grew into adulthood without a sense of identity, belonging, or history. They did not know their parents' names. They did not remember the songs of their people. They did not even know where they had been born. Their lives had been rewritten by the slave trade, and their original stories erased. Yet even in the darkest corners of captivity, the human spirit found ways to fight back. Some children ran away, slipping into forests or deserts despite the risk of death. Some sabotaged tools, slowed down work, or refused to speak the language of their captors. Others passed on songs and stories in secret, keeping the memory of their people alive. A few grew up to become leaders of revolts, turning the pain of their stolen childhood into fuel for resistance. These acts rarely made it into history books. They were not written down. But they mattered. They were proof that even when everything was taken, name, family, freedom, the will to resist could not be chained. The children who were stolen did not disappear into nothingness. They built the world around us. Their labor cleared forests, planted crops, built walls, and carried empires on their small shoulders. Palaces in Istanbul, plantations in Brazil, and mansions in the Caribbean all bear the fingerprints of those whose childhoods were stolen. Some were forced into royal households as servants or eunuchs, never knowing their true names. Others became soldiers, taken so young that they forgot the villages they were born in. A few were paraded like trophies at the courts of Europe, given as gifts to prove wealth and power. They were dressed in foreign clothes, taught foreign languages, and used as living symbols of conquest. But the cost of this human machinery was not only physical. Generations of children grew up without knowing where they came from. Cultures were broken. Oral traditions faded because the children who should have carried them forward were scattered across the globe. In many African societies, children were the storytellers, the learners, the carriers of memory. By taking them, the slave trade did more than remove individuals, it tore entire futures apart. One of the cruelest crimes of the slave trade was the erasure of identity. When children arrived in foreign lands, their names were often changed immediately. A boy named Kofi became John. A girl named Nia became Mary. In the ledgers of slave ships and markets, they were reduced to numbers, listed like cargo, male, age 7, female, age 9. Few records mention where they came from. Fewer still record who their parents were. The archives of empires are full of statistics and prices but empty of humanity. For historians, this erasure has created a silence that is difficult to break. We know that millions of children were trafficked, but most of their stories are lost. We know they existed because the economy of slavery depended on them. We see traces of them in census data, shipping manifests, and plantation records. Yet their individual lives, their thoughts, their fears, their dreams, remain invisible. This silence is why they are called forgotten. History books often focus on adult men and women. They speak of rebellions, revolts, and abolitionist heroes. But the stories of children, the most vulnerable victims, are buried under centuries of neglect. The slave trade did not only shape the past, it shaped the present. By tearing children from their communities, it disrupted generations of growth, innovation, and leadership. Entire villages lost their future elders. Whole kingdoms lost potential thinkers, builders, and leaders. Imagine a village where half the children disappear. Schools would never grow. Traditions would not be passed down. Languages could vanish in a single lifetime. This is what happened across much of Africa, and its consequences still echo today. Some historians believe that the underdevelopment of many regions is partly a result of this stolen future. Children who could have become teachers, farmers, inventors, or healers were instead made to serve foreign masters. The continent lost centuries of progress, not because it lacked potential, but because that potential was kidnapped and sold. Even after abolition, the trauma did not end. Children born into slavery after their parents were captured often inherited their status. They grew up not knowing freedom at all. Generations lived and died without ever touching the land of their ancestors. Today, the memory of these children survives in fragments, in folktales whispered by elders, in songs sung in distant lands, and in the faces of people whose ancestors were scattered by force. Some families still tell stories of a lost child who was taken by strangers. Others have no stories left at all. In some places, monuments honor the victims of the slave trade. Yet few mention the children. Museums and memorials often focus on ships, chains, and abolition, but not on the small hands that picked cotton, ground grain, and served at tables they could never sit at. Still, memory endures. Every lullaby sung in an African language in the Americas, every dance performed in secret, every name reclaimed by descendants, these are acts of resistance against forgetting. They remind the world that those children existed, that they were loved, and that their lives mattered. Although centuries have passed since the height of the slave trade, its shadow still stretches across our present. The descendants of those forgotten children live today in every corner of the world, in the Americas, the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. Many still struggle with the legacies of racism, displacement, and identity that began when their ancestors were taken. The patterns of exploitation have also evolved but not disappeared. Around the world today, millions of children continue to be trafficked for labor, sex, and servitude. The same greed that drove the slave trade still exists, only the forms have changed. The past is not as distant as we like to believe. The forgotten children of history are reflected in the forgotten children of today. Remembering their stories is not only an act of justice for the past, it is a warning for the present. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, greed, and humanity's capacity for cruelty. But it also challenges us to build a future where such stories are never repeated. To remember is to resist. Every time we speak of those forgotten children, we give them back a piece of the identity that was stolen from them. We turn statistics into names, numbers into faces, and silence into stories. Modern historians, genealogists, and descendants are working tirelessly to uncover the lives hidden in dusty archives. Oral traditions, DNA research, and historical records are slowly piecing together the stories of children who were once erased. Each name rediscovered is a small victory against the darkness of history. Schools, documentaries, and public memorials are also beginning to shift focus. They are telling the stories of children, not only as victims, but as resilient human beings whose strength shaped the world we live in today. This act of remembering is more than history. It is justice. In the stillness of forgotten fields, in the ruins of old slave markets, in the waters that swallowed so many dreams, the voices of those children still whisper. They whisper of the games they never played, the songs they never finished, the futures they never lived. We cannot return what was stolen from them. We cannot undo the pain. But we can refuse to let them vanish again. We can say their names. We can teach their stories. We can make sure that when history is told, it is not just the story of kings and conquerors, but also the story of the smallest and the weakest, whose lives were no less valuable. Because they were not just slaves. They were sons and daughters. They were brothers and sisters. They were children, forgotten by history, but remembered by us. And as long as we speak of them, as long as we carry their stories forward, they will never be forgotten again.